Welcome back to another edition of the BrownZone.com Zone Coverage Podcast. My name is Andy Barch with AM 930 WEOL and 100.3 FM. As always, joined alongside Scott Petrak, Browns beat reporter for the Chronicle, Telegram, the Medina Gazette, and of course, BrownZone.com. Scott, great to be joined by you once again. And, well, we have a big Browns victory to discuss today.
Yeah, we do. It was a big game, and we'll get to all the details. But, you know, when you look at this season, I think this is a game that when we get to the end of it, we could look back and say, all right, that's where the season turned.
Absolutely. We'll get to the turning point in the game. We'll get to what this does for this team as far as getting them on the map. More balance in the offense with Freddie's play calling doing much, much better, it seemed, than it did a week ago. And we'll also talk about the whole OBJ saga as well. And then we'll get into next week's game against the San Francisco 49ers as well. But, Scott, let's start with your major takeaways from this Sunday's win.
Well, it starts with where they are in the division. You know, and the difference between 2-2 and 1-3 does not seem significant, right? It's one game. But this was more than one game. And I just think I feel really strongly about that. And I think the Browns would agree in an honest moment. You go from being potentially 2 games plus a tiebreaker behind the Ravens, so let's call it 2.5 games, to even with the tiebreaker. So now you lead the division with the rematch at home. Just feels completely different. And I think you showed the Ravens, obviously you can win on their field, in their stadium, which is a tough place to play. The Browns are 19-4 now Browns are 4-19 since John Harbaugh took over as coach, so they don't have much success there. Let me take that back. They're 19-4 overall against Harbaugh. They're 2-10 in Baltimore against Harbaugh. So it just shows you how tough it's been for them, and to go in there against a Baltimore team that's playing well. They were 2-1. Their only loss was a close loss to a really good Kansas City team. They were feeling great about themselves. They had their Ring of Honor day. I mean, it's a big day in Baltimore. The Browns go in there and make a big statement. So that's number one, and I think it sets them up for the rest of the season. I think they can finally, not only the Browns, but the fan base, can exhale. All right, this is kind of what we thought the Browns were going to be. Play games like this. By far their best game of the year. Now they just have to sustain it, obviously, but you needed to see it first, right? They hadn't done it. They kept saying we're close and we're confident, but you needed to see it happen, and it did happen. They played a pretty full game. Offense, defense, special teams. Not everything was perfect, but they played well together. They beat a quality team on the road. Just all those things. Baker played better. Freddie called better plays. Put all of it together, and all of a sudden, if you had doubts Sunday morning, I think all of a sudden you're looking at the schedule now, you're going, yeah, I think the Browns are right on track for whatever it is, 10-6, 11-5, wherever you had them at the beginning of the year. I think you can figure out a way to get them there, and I'd be surprised. And I know it's one game, and I hate to make huge conclusions, but I would say I'd be stunned if they didn't make the playoffs now. And I didn't necessarily feel that Sunday morning when I did September 1st. You know, it's kind of the ride of emotions in the NFL. But I think this is more of the team that we expected, and I think it's more of the team that we're going to continue to see.
This, I certainly think, is the team that a lot of people expected. There was so much hype in the offseason, and it felt like some of that was taken away with that Week 1 loss against the Titans. Now, if you look at the following 2 weeks, not much was made of the victory over the Jets because the Jets have had some injuries. They've had a tough year so far. And then they came really close in that Sunday night matchup at home against the Rams. Their secondary was totally depleted, as we know, but that also came down to the final moments of that game, which is why the game last Sunday set up the way it did against the Ravens, because this was the kind of game I think we all looked at and thought, okay, if they win this tells us that they finally arrived and all that hype in the offseason was finally worth it. Not to mention, there are a lot of people out there outside of Cleveland right now looking at this and thinking this could be their division.
Yeah, well, exactly right. And, go back to those first 3 games, what was probably the most disappointing besides the record was the offense didn't look like the offense everybody anticipated. They're averaging 16 points a game. Baker wasn't Baker. Freddie wasn't calling the same type of plays. It didn't look like you expected. And for whatever reason, I picked, and I'm not tooting my own horn here, maybe I am, but I picked them to win against Baltimore, right? I picked them to score 30 points. I just felt like it was going to finally click, but there hadn't been evidence. Like, there was a little bit of a faith-based pick there. Because I'm like, I think they have it in them. I like the vibe in the locker room, but we hadn't seen the offense perform yet. And really, it was really inconsistent. And then they put it together. And you're right when you talk about the division. Now, yes, Baltimore has also an easy schedule, right? Because they play pretty much the same teams that the Browns play. But, there's only one difference. I mean, that's how the NFL sets it up. There's only one difference in their schedules. However, the rematch is at home. It's late in the season. The Browns just feel more of a complete team. And if you liked them heading into the season, this was just an affirmation of, yep, they have the talent. They're probably more talented than Baltimore. Now it all has to play out, and you still have to win games and all that. But I went from not being sure where this team was and where it was headed and thinking maybe they'll get it together too late to now figuring, yeah, this is their division. They just have to go about, they just have to take care of business. That's how I feel.
And they certainly took care of business on Sunday. That, again, was one of those wins I think everybody looking at thinking, okay, have they arrived yet? And the way they won on the road, with all those emotions at play that you mentioned in Baltimore, certainly a huge one for the Browns. We talk about how that was a turning point in the season, or we think it will be a turning point in the season. In your mind, what was the turning point in the game?
Yeah, I think there were two. And we talked about this briefly before we came on. The Mark Ingram fumble. And it was earlier in the third quarter. Browns had the lead. But Baltimore, people have talked about how the Browns defense played well, and it held its own. But it didn't dominate. I mean, Baltimore was able to run the ball, right? Mark Ingram had a big half. Lamar Jackson had a big half running the ball. They did a good job limiting the deep passing plays. Marquise Brown wasn't a factor at all. But they were moving the ball. I'm watching the game going, it feels like Baltimore can score when it wants, right? So all of a sudden, they're marching. And Jermaine Whitehead, and we could talk about him later, is playing out of his head, is that third safety, moves into a starting role with injuries, knocks the ball out of Mark Ingram's hands. Chad Thomas, the defensive end who hasn't done a whole lot in a year plus, dives on the ball, stops the scoring drive. I think the Browns march down and wind up scoring on Nick Chubb's first of his 3 touchdowns. I think it was the first. And that changed the game. All of a sudden, the Browns are up 2 scores. You can relax a little bit. It doesn't feel as tight. Now the pressure's on Baltimore. So that's the first one. Plus, Baltimore hadn't had any turnovers all year, and that was the first one they had. So that's a big play. And then, fast forward a little bit, Baltimore scores a touchdown, goes for 2 and gets it. So all of a sudden, it's 24-18. The fans are back into it. That stadium gets loud. It's hot. The Browns... Taywan Taylor decides to take the ball out of the end zone on a kickoff return, which is a bad move. Gets tackled at the 17. I think it was Eric Kush gets a false start. All of a sudden, it's 1st and 15 from the 12. You're thinking this could go sideways here, right? All of a sudden, Baltimore gets the ball back and scores. They're leading, and the Browns are up against it. Nick Chubb goes 88 yards. All of a sudden, boom, things are back to normal. You can feel good about yourselves. So those are the 2 moments you pick out and you go, when the game had a chance to tilt the other way, the Browns made 2 huge plays to keep it in their advantage, and that's what good teams do.
Nick Chubb clearly had a huge game, no question about that. And you had heard people over the last few weeks clamoring for there to be a bit more balance offensively, and it seemed like things kind of changed a little bit from a play calling perspective. I know Freddie Kitchens was really under fire for some of his play calling, especially in that game against the Rams. Seems like they were able to achieve a bit more balance offensively this week.
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think there's 2 big takeaways from that. Number one is they realize that Nick Chubb might be their best player. And Myles Garrett would give you an argument there, but through 4 games, to me, Nick Chubb's been their best player. And if you have that guy, give him the ball, right? I mean, and it's so much easier. It's so much easier to give Nick Chubb the ball and let him go to work than it is to try to scheme up getting the ball to OBJ, right? Because defense can put 2 guys on OBJ, and that's what they've done, right? Odell Beckham Jr. is still the same receiver, but defenses can really focus on that. And the fact is, they're not putting 8 guys in the box to stop Nick Chubb because they have to devote attention to OBJ and Jarvis Landry. So give the ball to Nick Chubb because he's so good. And number 2, it helps your offensive line because they like to run block and they're not in pass protection as much, which helps where they're weakest. Where they're weaker is the pass protection. And it takes some pressure off Baker Mayfield. All of a sudden, he doesn't have to drop back 45 times a game. And what they did Sunday, which I thought was critical and gets overlooked a little bit, is they put him under center more. At least that's what it felt like. I haven't looked at the analytics, but it sure felt like that. And the benefit of that is all of a sudden you can run play action. And that gives your quarterback easier reads and easier throws because the linebackers have to commit. When you're running out of the shotgun so much, the play action just isn't as effective. And we saw it on both sides. Lamar Jackson and Baker had easy throws and easy success, especially early, throwing off play action. And I think that was a change that Freddie made. One of several play calling changes he made, and that was one of them. So Nick Chubb just has such an influence on the rest of the offense when he is a focal point.
How much of that do you think makes a difference? And here's why I ask this. Because it seems like we're coming up on that cycle where what's old becomes new again, right? I mean, everybody runs out of the shotgun, right? In college, it's kind of difficult to find the teams that don't anymore, and a lot of that is kind of translated into the NFL game. I would imagine Baker probably didn't go up under center very often in college, and in the pros last year, of course, in his first year, it certainly didn't seem like he did much of it. It seems like that's become a bit of an easier transition for a guy like him, and just to stick with this for a second too. Over the last few weeks, a lot of people have said, you know what, he's hanging on to the ball too long, right. And you're taking more steps when you're dropping back under center too. So it's weird how that kind of took a total 180 this past week.
Yeah, and there's so much involved with that. Because you're right about it. At Oklahoma, I remember going back and watching as many as Oklahoma games as I could watch. And I'm not sure he was under center 5 times, right? And we're talking 6-8 games. And that's just the way of the world in most colleges. Pat Mahomes is the same way. You watch colleges, this is a little side rant, but you watch colleges, they get to 3rd and 1 and 4th and 1, and they can't run a quarterback sneak because the guy's never taken a ball under center, right? So they snap it 5 years back, and then what do you do? So I think colleges should do that more, but that's neither here nor there. It's an adjustment to the NFL that you have to make. And I don't know if it's the end of the world, but some guys struggle with it. You turn your back to the play. Like, there's just a lot of differences going on there. But the coaches that insist on running from under center, and nowadays in the NFL, I think the average is 65, 70% in shotgun. So it doesn't happen a lot. But the reason you do it is for play action. Like, that's the number one reason to go under center, is because it changes how defenses have to play you. And to me, it's an underrated part of offensive schemes and something that needs to be in your offense. Unless you're going to be complete, spread them out, kind of like Kansas City does, spread them out, we're going to throw the ball 45 times a game. But that's not how this team's built. And I don't think Baker Mayfield is ready to be that kind of quarterback, especially against difficult defenses where you throw it 45 times. I think he's a better quarterback. Not that you have to game manage with him, but he's better with the balance. He needs a little help still in his career as opposed to flinging it 50 times like a Dan Marino or whoever. So that's why under center is so important, and I think Baker's fine with it. I think last year he threw great off play action. So once you get past that initial awkwardness of getting the snap, your steps are different, the play action is different. So once you get over that, I think quarterbacks really do appreciate that. The only other difference is you do have your back to the line for a little bit, but if you can trust your play call and you can trust your line a little bit, it really does open things up for the quarterback.
We've got you locked into the BrownZone.com Zone Coverage Podcast with Scott Petrak. I want to spend some time on OBJ here for just a moment, then we'll transition into this San Francisco 49ers matchup on Monday night, another primetime matchup for the Browns. Look, I think anytime you win a game, especially of this magnitude, you won't hear many guys complain. OBJ was looked at as more of a decoy in this victory, only had about 20 yards receiving. Now, his buddy, Jarvis Landry, certainly got his. He went well over the century mark on Sunday. But do you get the impression that they're going to have to get him more involved, only because in this offense there are certainly a lot of mouths to feed, and in a win like this he's not going to say very much, but I would imagine that if he's only targeted a few times a game moving forward, that could be a problem.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I mean, if they keep winning games, everybody says OBJ will be fine, and my guess is his numbers will even out. Even after that 2 for 20, he's still on pace for 1,200 yards and 80 catches, I think. He needs more touchdowns. He only has the one long touchdown against the Jets. But you're right. He's not going to be happy with 2 for 20 every week. And the Browns know that, and the coaching staff knows that, and Baker knows that. And I'm sure they'll make an effort, more of an effort to get him the ball. Now, it's not like they didn't throw to him. I think he had maybe 7 official targets. There was a couple penalties that he got thrown the ball, and they don't count against his targets because the play got erased from a penalty. There was a illegal contact. He picked up a first down. So they were trying to get him involved, but Marlon Humphrey did a good job for the Ravens. They also devoted some double coverage to OBJ, which he says he sees every week. But I thought it was really interesting that Freddie Kitchens went out of his way Monday when we talked to him to talk about how OBJ was downfield blocking when Jarvis had those real long plays. What a selfless teammate. It shows what great character he has. He went out of his way to really prop him up after what statistically was the worst game of his career, right? He's been in the league 5+ years. It's the worst statistical game for him. So I think Freddie knows that he's got to, I don't know, stroke is the right word, but he's got to build up, keep OBJ in the right mindset. But he also has to recognize that the fact that they double-teamed him let Ricky Seals-Jones run right down the seam for 59 yards. Like, there's give and take there, and the Browns recognize they're taking away Odell, and they went other ways. Now, at some point, defenses might back off and say, okay, we're going to have to play truer defense because they have more weapons. It'll be interesting to see, number one, if Jarvis is out this week with a concussion, which usually guys miss at least 1 week with the concussion, maybe then you got to really force the ball. You hate to say the word force, but be committed to getting the ball to OBJ because all of a sudden your number 2 target's not there. And then let's assume they get all the targets back at some point. Antonio Callaway's back this week off the suspension. Rashard Higgins should eventually come back from this knee that's helped him out 3 games now. Once you get that going, and especially Callaway because he's such a deep speed threat, I think defenses will have to adjust, and Odell won't see quite the same safety help that he's getting now because if you devote that one safety to Odell and you leave Callaway one-on-one, he's going to run by cornerbacks. So I think as the season goes on, Kareem Hunt comes back, all of a sudden when you have more pieces to worry about from a defensive perspective, I think Odell will get his.
I think he certainly will. It's going to be interesting to follow this because you're right. I mean, his worst statistical game of his career, yet certainly there were some things that definitely stood out. And look, it was a very, very big win.
Sure.
And not to harp too much on the magnitude of the win, but look, this was a monster victory because let's just say they don't win on Sunday, right? Then you're looking at another primetime game, and you're really under the microscope again. Now it's something that you really gear up for because you're in the spotlight on Monday night and taking on an unbelievably good San Francisco 49ers team, one that really has kind of turned things around here over the last few years. They've got a lot going for them, and I don't know how big of a deal this is made in the NFL about going all the way across the country. You're playing in a different time zone. If it's just for one night, I guess maybe it's not as big of an adjustment as I'm making it sound, but that's kind of a big deal for some of these guys.
Yeah, it's not easy, and I think it does help playing at night, although maybe not because all of a sudden you're really playing – you're playing at 8 o'clock your time, so the Browns have done that twice already, so they're playing at 5 in San Francisco time. So I think they'll be okay. It's not as bad as a team coming to the East Coast and you got to get up and play at 10 a.m., but it is an adjustment. Freddie has been honest and adamant and open about that it is a change when you go on the road, just everything about going on the road. But it's a Niners team that's interesting to me. They were kind of the it team going into 2018. Jimmy Garoppolo had played well when he finished the year before after the trade, and Kyle Shanahan, and everybody was really high on those guys. And then Garoppolo gets hurt early. They fall apart, right? I don't even know what record they finished with, but obviously it wasn't good. And I thought they kind of disappeared. And then Jimmy Garoppolo struggled in the preseason. And then you saw different kind of expectations. I noticed Peter King from Monday Morning Quarter, or NBC now, I think had him like this. It's their 7th best team in the league coming into the season. But then plenty of people didn't have them going to the playoffs. So they were kind of one of those teams you didn't know what to expect. They're off to a really solid start, right? 3-0, coming off a bye, which should help them. They got all the time in the world to prepare for this Browns team. We know Kyle Shanahan as a coach, what he likes to do because he was here in 2014. They're going to run the ball. They're going to run play action off that zone scheme. It makes life difficult on a defense. It makes life hard on your front four because you're always moving sideways as opposed to heading up the field. So it's a difficult test. Now, luckily for the Browns, and to go back to our starting statement, is that win against Baltimore gives them some leeway, right? There's some cushion there. If they had been 1-3, all of a sudden you're looking like, where are they going to get these wins? Where are they going to come from? Now you can say, if they lose to San Francisco and come home and beat Seattle, you're still 3-3, right? And I hate to get too far ahead of myself because it's a 1 week at a time league. But to me, there's a strict demarcation line in this season, and it's after the 7th game against New England, October 27th. The 5 games in a row up until then are really hard, and it started with that Rams game. And it goes, went Rams, Ravens, at Niners, home for Seattle, bye week, at New England. And then it gets way easier. It's Denver, it's Pittsburgh twice, it's Cincinnati twice, it's Arizona, it's Buffalo. And you can see the Browns making a run. My point being, if the Browns get through New England at 3-4, I think they're set up to go 10-6, 11-5. And that gets them in the playoffs, especially if they beat Baltimore in that rematch in late December. So, obviously you'd like to see them go 3-0 or 2-1. But if they win one of these next three, I think they're fine. And if they can duplicate that performance against Baltimore, they should go at least 1-3, right? They should win at least, or 1-2. They should win at least one of those games, probably more. If they play like they did in Baltimore, I think they beat the 49ers. They just have to do it back-to-back weeks. And that's the next step in this team, right? This team with talent, can they sustain it? Can they do it week in and week out? And we'll see. It should be a good game. It should be a really good test.
October certainly seems like it's setting up to be a month of survival for the Browns because you're right, second half of that schedule, at least on paper, looks a heck of a lot easier. Looking at this San Francisco matchup, and, we record this on Tuesday, so obviously there are a lot of things up in the air right now as far as injuries and availability as well. You mentioned Antonio Callaway. What are the expectations there? Because if Jarvis Landry is not able to play on Monday night, well, Callaway's going to be called on to play a huge, huge role.
Well, that's exactly right. And that's what was interesting. We talked to Freddie on Monday. And we hadn't talked about Callaway in at least 4 weeks, right? Because he wasn't around. I mean, he was actually in the building. I saw him a couple times. But, you got other stuff to worry about. I'd meant to ask him about him Friday. Like, hey, is he still on schedule here? So we finally got to ask him about him Monday. And he's like, yeah, he's back. He goes, I expected he's done all the right things. I expect he's in shape. And I said, well, he might have to play a role here. Can he come in right away? And he said, I'm paraphrasing. Yeah, why wouldn't he be? Or that's exactly what I expect. Something like along those lines. My point being, I think Freddie knows he's going to have a big role and knows that he better be ready. And that's not a guarantee with any player. It's certainly a young player like Callaway who's had his issues, coming off suspension, didn't show up to camp in great shape. I think that's Freddie sending a message like, hey, you better be ready because we could be down Landry. We could be down Higgins. I don't know if to put him in the starting lineup right away, but for me, he's no worse than your third guy. It's Beckham, Ratley, Callaway. So he's going to play a bunch, assuming Landry and Higgins are out. He's going to play a bunch right away, and they need this kid to have his head straight. So it's pivotal because if he doesn't play well, if he's running the wrong routes or not lined up right or whatever, and defenses in the Niners say we're just going to put everybody on OBJ, and Callaway can't take advantage of that, then the Browns are going to have a hard time moving the ball through the air.
Which unit in particular do you think is really going to be under the microscope on Monday night?
Well, man, that's a good question. We talk so much about the defensive line, and it's played well. And we saw Ogunjobi with another sack against the Ravens. Olivier Vernon gets his first sack against the Ravens. And Miles obviously has a 6 in the first 3 games. But I still don't think that unit has played to its potential. Let's say, I think it can be a dominant force, and we've talked about this. And I haven't seen it dominate. We've seen flashes, we've seen steady play. Like, it's been a really good unit. You could argue it's been the best unit on the team. But we haven't seen, like, a game where they just go nuts and they wreck the game. And I think it's hard to do that against that Kyle Shanahan scheme. Like I said, it's all its own scheme. You got everybody going sideways. And even if it's a pass, you start sideways and it's like a false step. I want to see how they handle that because they're never going to get the chance to really rush Jimmy Garoppolo and go after him unless they shut down the run. So you got to shut down the run. You got to get a lead. And then Myles Garrett has a chance to go beat whoever that left tackle is, right? Whoever that, Joe Staley, I think. Whoever the right tackle is. They've been moving him around a bunch. But you need to stop the run first. And I think we hear that every week. I think it's truer than ever against this kind of scheme. And I flash back to Kyle Shanahan when he was here in 2014. And obviously his exit was ugly. He did the big PowerPoint. He showed the Haslam's why you should let him out of his contract. And the Ray Farmer texting or calling the sideline. All that nonsense and all that dysfunction from 2014-15. But of all the coordinators that have been here, and the Browns have had a ton of them, he's the one that you were sad to see get away. Like, he was a big loss. You talk about the quarterback and Johnny and 15 and all that. the loss of Kyle Shanahan was huge for Coach Mike Pettin because, you can flash back to those years and then where they were started out 7-4. Even when they were losing, they would run the ball. Like he committed to that, and he's done it everywhere he's been. He got it from his dad, Mike Shanahan, and it just puts pressure on the defense because you can't say we're only going to rush the passer because even if they're down 10 in the third quarter, they're going to run. So I'm going to go back to that D-line. Really has to be stout against the run first, and then when it gets those opportunities to just haul out on 3rd and long, they got to take advantage.
Going to be a lot of fun to see what happens on Monday night. Scott, we've reached that point in the interview where we have to pick out the golf shot of the week. I know that the opportunities have been somewhat limited here in recent weeks, but what was your golf shot of the week?
Well, it's a good question. Usually I obsess over the golf shot of the week, and I spend a lot of time thinking about my golf game, but a lot of Browns action going on. It was a big game, so I haven't flashed back to that Wednesday round at Shale Creek. But as I think about it, had a solid back 9, made a bunch of pars. You know what? I'm going to go with, it was a par 5, I want to say number 14. It comes back. It's got trouble on the left. It hit a decent drive, hit a decent kind of rescue club, nothing to write home about. But then I had about 150 yards from the rough, and I had a real good 7-iron. Just a solid 7-iron, made for an easy 2-putt par. There was no great shot. I made a long par putt on the next hole, but putts aren't that, fun to talk about. It's a good putt, though. So I'll go with that 7-iron. It's just a solid, off the club face, right where I was aiming, left me 18 feet and a routine par. So, unless I'm forgetting one, that's what I'll go with.
Putts aren't that bad to talk about, depending on how far away they are, right?
Yeah, it was about that one. I thought it had a good iron. It was just short, and I had a bad chip. And it ran about, 12 feet past. And I was on a string of pars there, and then I made the 12-footer. So I'll take that one too. But yeah, it was good. It was good to get out. It was a great day. We've had some decent fall weather here, and I'm hoping to get out tomorrow. The Browns have a funky schedule this week because of the Monday night game, but they're off Wednesday, so I'm hoping to get out and play a little golf Wednesday.
Well, another primetime matchup coming up on Monday, which is nice, and there are certainly some whispers about some other primetime matchups that could be on the way as well. So we'll discuss that perhaps in another week. Scott, as always, a pleasure. Always fun to talk about the Browns and always more fun to talk about a Browns victory. We'll do this again next week.
Sounds good. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Scott. Again, Scott Petrak, Browns beat reporter with the Chronicle Telegram, as well as the Medina Gazette, and, of course, BrownZone.com. That's going to wrap things up on this BrownZone.com zone coverage podcast. For Scott Petrak, this is Andy Barch saying thank you so much for tuning in, and we will speak with all of you again next week.